Hellblade is a game that has left an impression on me even after the credits rolled, and even though it follows a Celtic warrior that traveled to a faraway land to fight her way to the gates of hell, it's more than what it initially shows at surface value. It's not just about a warrior fighting monsters. Hellblade at its core is a game about loss and acceptance.
But her world changed the day the Northmen took him from her.
The 6-hour campaign took me a little over half a month to complete. It wasn't because I didn't have time, I couldn't get myself to sit down for longer than 30 minutes to play this game. The reason for that is how they portray their main character Senua. You enter the game hearing a voice speak to you cryptically in the beginning, but then you quickly realize that it's not just one voice. Senua is constantly haunted and berated by voices in her head that accompany you throughout the entire game. It genuinely disturbed me to a point where it was exceedingly difficult to continue without extended breaks. This may sound like a negative, but I was extremely fascinated that a game could make me feel this way, so instead of simply ending my time with the game, I pushed myself and continued. But then I saw the first of its faults, or rather heard.
Senua pushes away a world that conspired to cause so much suffering. There's nothing to go back to, and worse to look forward to.
You start out the game in a forest making your way to the meat of the game, Helheim. It's constantly referenced throughout the game that this is your main objective. The forest sequence serves as a sort of extended tutorial lasting about 2 hours in my first playthrough, and this is where you get introduced to the permadeath feature in the game.
It will spread towards her head, the seat of the soul, until there is nothing left of her. All of her suffering will have been for nothing. It's just a matter of time.
Now this isn't something that I was expecting, and it authentically created a sense of consequence that follows you and amplifies your mistakes, in your own mind at least, for the remainder of your playthrough. That added another layer of immersion that enhanced my experience. However, since it took me so long to complete the forest sequence, I started to notice that the voices would often repeat lines as if it were on a loop and not a manifestation of Senua's mind. This isn't necessarily a mistake on the developer's end, but it took me out of the experience, which was a little disappointing. Luckily, this didn't persist to the rest of the game and was only blatantly apparent to me in the beginning. Right before they introduce you to the permadeath feature, you get a glimpse of the combat in the game, and this is where I'm kind of at odds with myself. When it was first introduced, I was worried I would die and have to start the game over again. Once I got over that fear, I realized that the combat is actually very easy and predictable. You can roll from side to side, step back, block, parry, and charge at your enemies. There's an auto lock mechanic that you can't disable, and all this adds up to making the combat feel really boring at times, or at least at the beginning of the game. I say that because initially you only have to fight 3 or 4 enemies and they come at you one at a time. Not only that, but they are the same enemy archetype, so it feels mundane and gets stale very quickly, until you get past the forest sequence. Now, there were moments in the forest where the combat was interesting. The mini bosses you fight felt like a real challenge. They had patterns that you had to learn and tells that you had to predict in their attacks a few milliseconds beforehand. Those moments were great, but the combat really starts to shine in the second half of the game, where they introduce even more enemies and they let them fight you 3 or 4 at a time. And while you're fighting, you can still hear the voices in your head. Sometimes they ridicule you and laugh when you get damaged. Other times they shout helpful advice, calling out enemy locations, and act as a sort of detection system since there is no in-game HUD. It felt like they were trying not to overwhelm you with the combat at the start, but I think they overestimated the amount of time that it will take a player to get comfortable with the mechanics, and the end result was a section of the game where combat was uninteresting. Another slight issue I found is the way they decided to implement their collectibles in the game. It takes a form of Norse symbols scattered throughout the land. Each time you find one of these symbols, there is a voiceover telling stories of Norse mythology. It's interesting to listen to, but the issue arises when you try to physically continue in the game. The farther you get away from the symbols, the quieter the voiceover becomes. And while you are at first interested enough to stay and listen to it, by the 10th symbol you get tired of standing in the same location staring at nothing waiting for the voiceover to finish. The reason why they did this was because they didn't want the Norse mythology voiceover to conflict with the actual in-game action. Luckily, there isn't anything vital to the story and the symbols, so if you do choose to opt out of them, it's not going to take away from anything in the main game. However, it was honestly very intriguing, and every time I walked away from it, I knew I wasn't missing anything, but I was a little disgruntled that they couldn't find out a way to make it more visually stimulating. And the worst part of it was the fact that when they introduced the man behind the voiceover in the game, they did do it in a visually stimulating way, which makes me wonder why they couldn't have it continue doing this mix of live action and in-game animation for the rest of the symbols. Maybe they just wanted to keep those sequences for important moments in the game? I'm not too sure.
Who are you?
It's just a memory.
Drew? Is that you?
For my tales of the Northmen, they call me Druth. A liar.
He's lost.
An old fool. Druth is my truth.
It's good to see you again. You kept your vow.
Guide you in this life and the next. I will tell you my stories of hell, if I may walk with you.
Something I didn't mention when I was talking about the combat was how little there was of it. I didn't mention it because I wouldn't describe this game as an action game. It's more along the lines of a puzzle game. This may come off as a surprise, but I would say that 60 or 70% of the actual game is puzzles. Now, all the puzzles have the same main objective. You look at a Norse glyph and you have to find where that glyph is hidden in the world around you. The ingenuity of it comes when they start to introduce more elements. Initially, you literally have to walk around and wait for the contextual signs to appear to see if you're in the right area. This is when the puzzles are at their worst. You feel like you're grasping at straws trying to make the glyphs line up when all you have to do is look at it from a different angle. And the most frustrating part of it is that this is one of a few issues that do persist throughout the entire game. And it's a major issue because this is the meat of the game. This is the thing that Hellblade has to get right, and at many points it doesn't. However, when it does click, it does it magnificently. One puzzle in particular that stood out to me was a puzzle where you had to maneuver your way to the top of a building by traveling between two different roads. And this concept was first introduced in the beginning of the game, but the reason why this stood out to me the most was because the amount of effort they put into this one particular puzzle. You felt like you were in a different role instead of just one piece of architecture adjusting to let you proceed through the puzzle. Not only was this fun to figure out, but it actually added to the story through the voices and the feeling that it gave you moving between worlds, letting you know that Senua at one point was not necessarily leading the perfect life, but it was a life where she was happy. That was communicated through flashbacks throughout the game, but it never really struck me how much she had lost and why she was going through the journey to hell in the first place until that one puzzle. And that wasn't the only moment in the game where I had felt a deeper connection to this character. There was one particular maze in the game where you were being helplessly chased down by a monster, and up until that point the permadeath feature wasn't a real issue for me, but for some reason this maze was really difficult for me to complete, and I ended up dying 6 or 7 times trying to complete it. And it reached a point where I was getting distressed. I could not get past this maze, and the voices didn't feel like they were in Senua's head anymore. I felt like they were in mine.
Save here, run! Senua, you don't run. Your sword. You came through the wrong door. Where's your sword? Defend yourself. It is that creature. You can't defend yourself. It's Dillian. Where are you?
All I could think about was how I was going to die and have to restart all my progress. It felt real, and no other medium in entertainment has ever made me feel like that. It was real fright. It wasn't a jump scare or a scary situation that disappeared as soon as I logged off the game. It was in my head, and it was real. I am going to talk a little bit more about the puzzles later on in the review, and how it's incorporated into another aspect in the game. Now, I did want to mention something real quick. It's a bit of a spoiler. Some of you may have already heard of it, but I just wanted to give a heads up before I talked about it. So if you don't want to have anything ruined for you, go ahead and skip to the time on the screen. Okay. There were talks about how the permadeath feature isn't real, and it was just a lie basically to make you feel more invested. And I didn't know about it until after I finished my first playthrough, but I had my suspicions. But the matter of fact is that at that moment when I was getting close to losing all my progress, it didn't matter if the permadeath feature was actually real or not. I felt like it was real, and all my suspicions vanished. And however the game managed to accomplish it, it made me feel the effects of losing. That's all I wanted to say about the matter. The game is graphically really good. There were a few camera issues near the end of the game, but it happened only in one specific spot, so it wasn't that big of an issue. I did also notice from time to time there would be texture popping issues with some characters. It happened very rarely, but when it did, it took me out of the experience. Overall though, they aced it in that department. I would say that they come very close to rivaling big AAA game developers like Naughty Dog. Not beating, but very close to rivaling. The music is very subdued throughout the entire game. There's a sort of low, echoey, nightmarish rumble going through Senua's mind at all times, and distant whispers, which really adds to the feeling of hopelessness. And even in common, they don't always add combat music. It's mostly just the whispers and more intense rumbling, but nothing I would call actual music. There are a few points in the game where they do add music, and since they use it so sparingly, it actually is effective at creating the tone that they want to create. Unlike most of the games where there's always background music accompanying you even when you're doing nothing. One thing I did notice with the sound design, I'm not too sure if it was intentional, but there was a faraway thunder going on even with clear skies, and I think they were trying to convey Senua's further loss of objective reality. Even though the weather was perfect, she couldn't get the feeling that there was a darkness above her, following her everywhere she went. And this leads me to the next section of the review.
You're pathetic. Rotten. Cursed. What were you thinking? Did you really think you could win? How stupid can you be?
So stupid.
Everyone hates her. She's cursed.
The shadow hates.
Look at you. A warrior. Worthless. Weak. Pathetic. Go on. Feel sorry for yourself.
Hellblade is a story about Senua and her not only battling the loss of her love, but also battling her own mind. This is a big part of the game and something that Ninja Theory spent a significant amount of time on. The puzzle elements intertwine so deeply with the fact that Senua does have psychosis, and I think that that's something very important for someone to understand before going into the game. All these visions and monsters aren't coming from Helheim, they're coming from her own mind. This is Hellblade's biggest positive and negative at the same time. There are points where you really can't understand what not just Senua, but people with advanced psychosis go through in their day-to-day lives. For example, when you try to advance in the game without completing a puzzle, there isn't something physical stopping you. There's no latch or lock on any of the doors. The thing that stops you is Senua. She can't continue because in her mind she knows that there's a connection between the door and random everyday objects. She just has to make that link in her mind before she can continue. And this is the main crux of all the puzzles. But the reason why I say it's negative is because you understand that concept very quickly, and after a while it stops adding depth to the game and starts to hinder it. It's so overused that you get tired of it by the end, and even though I understood what Ninja Theory was trying to go for, it was still too much. There was a section of the game where you basically had to traverse through different maps with some sort of stipulation. It was linked to a story element that they couldn't do throughout the game, but I feel if they had taken those sections and dispersed them throughout, and maybe even replaced some of the more lackluster puzzles with them, it would have made for a less monotonous experience. That being said, Ninja Theory did do their research in psychosis. They were very careful on how they handled that subject, but the way they implemented it into the game in regards to the puzzles was overdone. The story about Hellblade itself is where it excels. The setup for Hellblade is Senua trying to retrieve her dead lover's soul back from Hel, the Norse goddess that oversees Helheim. I think this one section from early in the game explains it pretty well.
In this waking nightmare, where all dreams come true, you searched for control, a way to pull through. When you were in love, you left him in tears to smother your furies and banish your fears. But in darkness they came, through stormy black seas they raided these shores. Do you still hear his screams? And now that you're home, he's so far away. They've taken his soul. To these gods you cannot pray. They can break you, but not your promise. Even death won't keep you apart. Through his darkness you will find him. In your sword still beats a heart. You fought for love unspoilt by your darkness within. You fought for your dreams. Now there's no way to win. In the head of his corpse lies the seat of his soul. So you must carry his vessel to bring him back home.
The game very much revolves around its story. You see Senua try to accomplish her goals and at times succeeding, other times failing, and just the mental anguish she is going through because she feels she has to in order to make amends for the things she has done. I wanted to go more in depth into the story, but the truth is that it's a simple story, but it's one that is executed very well. It really needs to be experienced in person in order to understand the magnitude of it and the subtleties. A big part of that is Melina Juergens, the voice actor for Senua, and the emotion she was able to bring out with this character. Just to wrap it up, Hellblade is a story about loss, and even though most of us aren't going to canoe to a different island and fight our way to hell, we've all had experiences where we lost someone that we cared about and did have to fight through the sadness and accept that they were gone. In that way, Hellblade is a very relatable and introspective story. Even though Hellblade had many minor issues throughout the game, they definitely don't overpower the feeling that it left me after I finished the game. With all its faults, Hellblade is still fantastic, and I would definitely recommend most people to play it, but to also understand what kind of game you're getting into before you do. Hellblade is a strong 9 out of 10.